Who killed Leota Camp? On Monday, July 10, 1967, Leota Camp, a 25-year-old mother of three, was found bound, gagged, and stabbed in her home. Leota and her husband were renting a home at 3213 Flemming Avenue in Des Moines, Iowa. At the time, it was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood with little or no through traffic. Miss Leota Hodges and Raymond Camp of Des Moines, Iowa, were married on January 20, 1961, at the home of Leota's parents in Unionville, Missouri. It was Leota's 21st birthday. In 1967, the Camps were still living in Des Moines. Raymond Camp, 25, worked as a tabulating equipment operator for the Iowa Employment Security Commission. Leota, as typical for the time, was a stay-at-home mom who filled her days doing household chores and taking care of her three small children, Kevin 4, Brenda 3, and 3-month-old Christine. The day had started off as a cool, foggy day in the upper 60s. Raymond Camp left for work as usual. Later that morning, the fog broke, and by mid-morning the temperature was around 80 degrees. Kevin and Brenda went to the backyard to play, along with some other children. Sometime in the late morning, Leota went outside to hang some laundry out to dry and to check on Kevin and Brenda. When she finished hanging the laundry, she went back inside to check on 3-month-old Christine. A little after noon, Kevin and Brenda went inside the house, perhaps to get something to eat. The two noticed Christine on a blanket on the living room floor. They then found their mother on the bed in the front bedroom, lying face down on blood-soaked sheets. There was a knife protruding from Leota's back, which Kevin removed and placed on the bed. After seeing this horrific scene, Kevin and Brenda ran to the home of a neighbor, Mrs. Mary Grow, of 3209 Flemming Street, saying that "Mommy is bleeding." Mrs. Grow then ran to the camp residence and found Leota lying on the bed. She then ran to Mrs. Nellie Edwards' house at 3217 Flemming Street, telling her to come quick. Something terrible has happened to Leota. Mrs. Edwards, after arriving at the camp residence, noticed 3-month-old Christine on the living room floor, lying on a blanket, feeding from a warm bottle. Mrs. Edwards then found Leota lying on a bed, face down, with her hands crossed and tied behind her back with neckties. Her ankles and neck were also bound with neckties. A necktie was stuffed in her mouth as a gag. Mrs. Edwards removed the gag from Leota's mouth and attempted to communicate with her. Leota was apparently still alive, but unfortunately unable to answer any questions. A 6-inch bloody knife was found next to Leota that had been removed from her back earlier by her 4-year-old son, Kevin. Mrs. Grow and her nephew, Max Gosling, called authorities, and a short time later, a fire department rescue squad arrived and began administering artificial respiration and continued for the entire 7-minute drive from the camp residence to the Polk County Hospital. Unfortunately, these efforts went for naught. She was pronounced dead on arrival. An investigation began immediately. Dr. Leo Luca, Polk County medical examiner, said Mrs. Camp had been stabbed 4 times in the back and that the wounds penetrated her lungs. He continued to say that she died of internal hemorrhaging and there was no evidence she had been raped. Leota was fully dressed in a blouse and skirt. The wounds were inflicted by 2 different knives, which were both from a kitchen knife rack. One knife was found on the bed, which had been pulled from Mrs. Camp's body by Kevin, and another blade presumably found in her body, missing the handle. Dr. Leo Luca said Mrs. Camp's killer was probably a kook or a pervert who got scared and panicked. The search for the killer begins. A neighbor told police that a young man parked his car about a house and a half away from the camp home at about 11 a.m. The man got out of the vehicle and cut diagonally across the camp front yard and entered the home. She thought the car might have been a Ford Mustang with louvers behind the doors. Police believed the model to be a Mustang Fastback from 1965 and 1966. Another neighbor saw him leave the house just before noon. He then walked to the car and drove off. Authorities believe the suspect to be white, about 23 to 30 years of age, stockily built with fair complexion, and about 5'9" to 5'10". He was wearing a brown and white plaid shirt and dark pants. He was also described as handsome with light brown curly hair and a good suntan, which seems to contradict the fair complexion observation by one of the other neighbors. With the help of the neighbors, police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect. Police Captain Cletus M. Leeming noted that the house showed no signs of forced entry and that the doors were unlocked. Investigators wondered if Mrs. Camp knew the killer based on his description and similar age range. The neighborhood is out of the way and one wouldn't likely drive down the street unless you lived there or were visiting someone specific. The obscene phone call. Leota Camp had received an obscene phone call several weeks before her murder. Raymond Camp told the registered newspaper that his wife Leota had received an anonymous telephone call about 2 to 3 weeks prior to her death. He said that Leota was feeding their 3-month-old child Christine at the time of the phone call. She put the baby down as the phone rang. She answered, and a man said, "Where you been?" It was a strange tone of voice. Mrs. Camp told the caller that she was feeding her baby, and the caller replied, "I thought maybe you were blank." Raymond wouldn't say the word that was used over the phone, but that it was an obscene expression. Leota was in shock. She hung up the phone and called Raymond at work to explain what happened. The caller never called again. Raymond revealed that their phone number was not listed in the phone book. Police looked into about 450 dark blue or black Ford Mustang Fastbacks with louvers behind the doors that led to no suspects. A $2,500 reward was offered by Raymond Camp, but did not lead to an arrest or a suspect. Captain Cletus Leeming said they have received over 1,000 leads and more than 600 people have been questioned, but the evidence in the case is very slim. He also said that most murders are committed by someone closely associated with the victim, and that in this case it doesn't appear to be true. The case went cold and still remains unsolved today. Anyone with information about the Leota Camp unsolved murder case is asked to contact the Des Moines Police Department at 515-283-4864 or the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation at 515-725-6010 or email at dcis.state.ia.us. And here is my take on the case. I think the suspect parked his car right there, and then he walked across the camp resident yard there, then up the steps. Was he let into the house by Leota? We don't know. But the police determined that the doors were unlocked. Did he go into the house when Leota was already in the house? Or was she in the backyard hanging up laundry because it's right around that same time? And then she goes back into the house. Did she surprise him? Or had she gone back into the house, then he was in the house? We don't have the exact time that she was hanging the laundry, okay? Now when you look at the street view shot right here, this is the front bedroom right here. This right here is the front door, and if you look at this picture, this is from Zillow, this is the front door right there. And let's see, if you go back, I think it's this one right here. Yeah, so now this is looking, as you're entering the front door, you're looking back this direction. Now this right here is the back bedroom, and then if you could go around this corner right here, there is another room, and that is what you see right here. That's what this window is, and you can actually see this house and these steps right there in that bedroom, and you can see that right here. You can actually see the sort of the rails to go up to the steps on this yard right here. See that? On this house. Okay, so that's the front bedroom. So that is where Leota's body was found, where she was stabbed 4 times in the back, in the lungs. The knife was found next to her, but the knife was actually originally in her back because their child, Kevin, is who removed the knife. And so when they mentioned that they found the knife next to her, it was because Kevin took it out. And then they mentioned that they found a second knife that was used, but they weren't able to find the handle of the knife. Okay, so that means that I believe it means that they found that blade inside of her, and that might be why he had to go use another knife, because it broke off. Okay, he wasn't finished yet. Now, was he there to sexually assault her and maybe just realized that there was kids outside and then just killed her so she couldn't identify him? We don't know the answer to that question. There's a lot of unknown. There's no answers to a lot of questions, but you can speculate. He went there without any weapons or the items that bound her. He used ties from the house, and then he used the knives from the kitchen block. So that means he wasn't prepared physically with items to kill her. So was it something where he was going to go over there and try to smooth talk her, but then she totally rejected him, and then he decided to bind her up and he was going to sexually assault her, and then he saw that there was kids outside, and then he killed her and left because maybe he knew her or she knew him. Something like that. There's a whole bunch of options that you can go with. Or he went in not bringing his own items and knowing that he would just use any items that were found around the house, much like James D'Angelo in the East Area Rapist case and Golden State Killer. I think the best bet of identifying who the killer is at this point would be to check the knife that was inside of her, because I don't know if it would have been all the way in. It seems like it would have hit bone and the handle broke, and if that's true, the killer could have easily cut his own finger, and there might be blood that was on her clothing, since she was fully clothed at the time, could actually be from the killer. There might be a secondary sample of DNA of an unknown male on her, in blood on her clothing. I'd also check the other knife. Even though Kevin touched it, the killer had touched it. If they didn't wear gloves, it's possible that they left some DNA on that knife as well, because if they'd cut their finger, they used that knife second. The one that was still sticking in her back, I think, is obviously the second knife used, and if he did cut his hand on the first knife, there would be blood on the second one. Okay, he had to get a second knife because the first one broke. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. So I would test that as well, and any of her clothing. I mean, I know this is way back in 1967, but if they stored it properly, which the odds aren't great since it was 1967, they could have a DNA profile of the killer. The suspect seems like he should have been relatively easy to find at the time, given that car that he was driving, the black 65 or 66 Mustang with louvers in the back. I guess they referred to it as a fastback. They did check all that they could find, and it never led to anybody, but I wonder if they checked the children of somebody who owned that. I mean, because he was pretty young. He could have been between, they said, 23 and 30, so maybe there was like a 45-year-old father that owned that, and he was using it. Also, the phone call was interesting. You know, it was sexual in nature. It was a call that came in when their phone number is not in the phone book, according to Raymond. Now, did Leota give her number out to somebody and didn't tell her husband about that? That's a possibility. The age range is within her age range, and it could be somebody that she gave the number to. He went over to the house, she rejected him, and then he was going to sexually assault her by tying her up and gagging her so she couldn't make any sounds. Then noticed that there were kids out in the backyard and ended up killing her to keep her quiet, and then casually leaves the house, gets in his car, and drives off again. It seems to me that the phone call is related. It seems like the odds of somebody randomly calling a number that's not in a phone book and making a strange phone call using a strange voice, sexual in nature, and then she dies 3 weeks later in her home. I just think that there's something associated with that. They obviously weren't able to track the phone call back to a particular location. If the call was made from a phone booth, then you know almost certainly that this is the person who killed her. If it was made just from a random residence and they checked it out, I know, you know, some kids around, they were just dialing random numbers, then, you know, obviously at that point it's not. But there was no mention that they were able to track down the phone call. Now, there was some interesting information in some articles online. There was an individual named Carol Wetherick. She lived a few houses away from the camps, and she left the house, this neighbor, left the house to go buy a new car, you know, right around that time. And then she says she believes that the killing was meant for her. She just wasn't home. She didn't really say why she believed that. She thinks she believes, and there goes my dog, she believes that there was a hitman sent for her, and the hitman killed Leota by mistake. There's also a serial criminal named James Mitchell DeBartleben, who a lot of people think may have been the killer as well. You guys can look him up online. It's James Mitchell, and then DeBardeleben. DeBartleben. All right, and they think that maybe he was associated with the killing. All right, so those are my general thoughts. I'm sure I have other ones that I've thought about, but I'm not thinking of them right at the moment. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed my first video on the Nefarious channel. I know a lot of people like to watch the shorter videos and get a recap of the case instead of my 3-hour shows where we actually look into the case together and try to figure things out. All right, so thank you very much, and look forward to the next videos that are coming out. And make sure that you hit the subscribe button before you leave. And also, if you aren't familiar, check out Gray Hughes Investigates, where I do have those 3-hour shows if you don't mind hanging out and trying to figure out cases with a bunch of people. we call each other the Freak Family. All right, because we're freaks. We're crime freaks. All right, have a good one. Oh, and one more thing. Be safe out there.